Many spells and traps are great not because of their on-field effect, but rather because of what they do after they're sent to the graveyard. In this video, we're going over some of the best spells and traps in the game that have great graveyard effects. Starting us off at number 10, we have Divine Sword Phoenix Blade. This is an equip spell card which can only be equipped to a warrior monster and grants it 300 attack. It also has a graveyard effect where you can banish 2 warriors from your graveyard and add it back to your hand. Phoenix Blade is a perfect card for this list, as it's only ever seen play for its graveyard effect. Its minor, type-locked attack boost was clearly meant to be compensated by the recursion, but in the end, this card was never really used as an actual equip. Their first strategy that started using Phoenix Blade was Diamond Dude Turbo, which is probably the first instance of a combo deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! DDT focused on getting Diamond Dude's effect off multiple times in a single turn, which is to excavate the top card of your deck, and then if it's a normal spell, you can use that card's effect for free during your next main phase. Phoenix Blade could be used to banish spit Diamond Dudes from your graveyard, which could then be brought back with Dimension Fusion alongside with other utility warrior monsters to be able to trigger their effects again. While this was a pretty good showing, no one could ever think this card was going to see play once more after they banned Dimension Fusion and Dark Magician of Chaos, the core parts of that combo. However, this card would once again come into the metagame when Isolde Two Tails Noble Knights came out. Isolde can send equip cards from your deck to the graveyard to summon a warrior monster from the deck with the same level as the number of cards sent, which is perfect for Phoenix Blade as it's one of the few equips of generic graveyard effect. This was abused extremely well in Gokey Nightmare, which used the Gokeys to turbo into Isolde as a way to start off their combo, and then could repeatedly get Phoenix Blade back from the graveyard by banishing the Gokeys and discarded for the Nightmare's effects. While this deck might not be around anymore, it was a sure thing that almost any deck that's abusing Isolde in a meaningful way is probably running Phoenix Blade. And at number 9, we have Rainbow Bridge of Salvation. This is a normal trap that makes both players shuffle all cards from their hand, field, and graveyard into the deck, and then each player draws 5 cards. But there needs to be 2 level 10 or higher monsters of different types on the field. It also has a graveyard effect where you can banish it to add a Crystal Beast monster and a field spell from your deck to your hand. While this card does have the same effect as the permanently banned Fiber Jar, that's not the reason why it was played, as getting 2 level 10s out with different types and flipping a trap card is probably the only thing harder than resolving a flip monster in 2022. This card's graveyard effect is extremely powerful though. Adding a field spell from the deck to the hand is something that has landed multiple cards in the ban list after all. Crystal Beasts, which actually became a short-lived road deck due to the release of modern support, have a really easy time dumping into the graveyard with Rainbow Bridge of the Heart. It can be used to fetch both a starter in Sapphire Pegasus and a floodgate such as Necro Valley. Still, since this card fetches you any field spell with no restriction, it has some splashability when paired together with Foolish Burial Goods, as long as you're fine putting a Crystal Beast Guarded in your deck. This package saw some play in Tier Limit decks since their field spell is one of the strongest archetypal field spells ever released. It worked great in Tier because not only can you get it for free sometimes with all the blind milling, but also because Crystal Beast Emerald Tortoise is an Aqua monster, which can be put back into the deck to make Tier Limit's Kit Kalos. Almost no other card in the game can give you such an easy +2 as a graveyard effect like Rainbow Bridge of Salvation does. And coming at number 8, we have Nekroz Kaleidoscope. This is a ritual spell which can be used to summon any number of Nekroz rituals from the hand. It requires you to either tribute a monster from the hand or field, or send a monster from your extra deck to the graveyard to pay for the ritual requirements. Its graveyard effect is that if you control the monsters, it can banish itself and a Nekroz monster from the graveyard to add a Nekroz spell from your deck to your hand. As one of the few Tier 0 decks that have ever existed in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, it took several ban lists and waves of power creep to push Nekroz out of the meta completely. This is not only due to how consistently they can get out their ritual engine, but also due to how powerful it was. All the Nekroz ritual spells share the same graveyard effect of being able to grab you a ritual spell from your deck if the field gets cleared, which gives you a ton of follow-up even if your field gets cleared by something like a Dark Hole. While all the other Nekroz ritual spells have something to set them apart from regular ritual spells, Kaleidoscope is probably the most unique out of all of them. Being able to send a monster from the extra deck as material essentially lets you bring out monsters with no setup. Even better, it can even instantly make up for the loss in card advantage by sending Herald of Arclight as a material, which can search you any ritual card with its graveyard effect. On top of all that, this is the only spell in the game which lets you ritual summon multiple monsters at once. By sending a high level monster like the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon from the extra deck, you can bring out multiple threats at once. However, even if we've only gotten better monsters to dump over the years, Nekroz are far past their prime these days, even if this is still one of the best ritual spells around to this day. And at number 7, we have Pantheism of the Monarchs. This card lets you send a Monarch spell trap from your hand to the graveyard to draw 2 cards. It can also banish itself from the graveyard to reveal 3 Monarch spell traps from your deck to your opponent, and they pick 1 to add to your hand. Pantheism was one of the best consistency pieces to ever grace an archetype back in the day, and this card's a pretty big reason why Monarchs were as good as they were. These sorts of draw 2, lose 1 effects have been in many cards which have seen play throughout the years, such as Trade-In and Allure of Darkness, but Pantheism's graveyard effect is what brings it even further. Not only are you seeing 2 new cards, while also possibly having the graveyard effect of the card you just pitched, you're also getting a pretty easy +1 after it's activated. While your opponent does get to pick the card you're adding, this doesn't usually matter because you can just reveal 3 copies of the card you want, or 2 copies of Tenacity of the Monarchs, which searches you any of the archetype spells and traps anyway. This card doesn't even brick in multiples because not only can it send itself to draw 2, but it also only has a hard once per turn on the graveyard effect, letting you dig really deep into your deck. Even if you don't draw into multiple, you can still use it at least twice in your turn because of Idea the Heavenly Squire, which lets you add it back if you banish a Monarch spell when it was sent to the graveyard. This was such a game changer that, back when we still had all the draw cards legal, Monarchs were used to great effect as an engine for FTKs, which aimed to draw through their entire deck and then kill their opponent with Life Equalizer and Magical Explosion. The scars these formats put on the player base were so deep that Pantheism, as well as a few other Monarch cards, ended up spending far longer than they should have on the limited list. And at number 6, we have Fusion Substitute. This is a normal spell which is always treated as polymerization. It can be used to fusion summon a fusion monster using materials from your field only. It can also be banished from the graveyard to return a fusion monster from your graveyard back to the extra deck and then draw a card. When it first came out, this card seemed like an almost strictly inferior regular polymerization, which traded being able to use materials from the hand for the ability to recycle your fusion monsters. However, this was already at the time where fusion decks were usually working within their own archetype spells mostly anyways. However, to everyone's surprise, this card would go on to become a pivotal combo piece and one of the most consistent tier threats in Yu-Gi-Oh history: Zodiacs. By going into Zodiac Broad Bowl, which could be done off of any Zodiac card, you could search for Lunalight Black Sheep, which can discard itself to add a poly from your deck to your hand. But since Fusion Substitute is always treated as poly, you can just add that instead, and then convert any 2 Xyz monsters in the field into Elder Entity Norden, which brings back a level 4 lower monster from your graveyard to the field on its special summon. Those 2 cards can then be used to either hard make another Broad Bowl for another Surge, or go for Daigusto Emerald for a draw, and then you can bounce Norden back later to draw another card with Fusion Sub's effect. Either way, Zoo combos at the time were almost always ending with you going at least +2 with a Derident out, but they could also become upwards of +5 if you had an instant fusion in your opening hand. Of course, none of that is possible anymore through the banning of both Norden and Broad Bowl. However, this card still had a very short burst of play in early tier limit builds. Since King of the Swamp can search it, you can also run Fusion Sub on top of Poly, as it can be used to return a Kid Callus to the extra deck, which can trigger Perloreno's effect to pop a card in the field even when you're locked out of fusion summons. And at number 5, we have Dragonmaid Tidying. This trap effect is to target a dragon monster you control and a card your opponent controls, and then bounce them both to the hand. While in the graveyard, this card can be banished to special summon a Dragonmaid monster from your hand or graveyard in defense position. Tidying has pretty much single-handedly enabled Dragonmaids to see any kind of competitive play almost by itself. A single bounce may not seem like much at first, but there's a reason why Compulsory Evacuation Device was limited for several years after all. A big reason why Dragon Link decks were meta for as many formats as they were was because, even if you got hit by several hand traps, the deck was most often than not going to end on at least Heretic Seal in this trap card. Despite looking somewhat unassuming at first, these 2 provided you with 2 very hard to play around interactions, as well as a complete follow-up on your next turn. The Heretic Seals can bounce a card without targeting and then bring out a dragon monster from your deck, which can then be returned to your hand with Tidying. During the next turn, not only do you have a great normal summon, but you also have Tidying to bring back Chamber Dragonmaid from the grave, which can search another copy of the trap to make the same board again. The power of such an opening even led to the community jokingly calling it the Seals Tidying FTK. In case your combo did go through, this card's graveyard effect could also be used to play around Dark Ruler no more. By chaining it to Dark Ruler, you can then chain Hot Red Dragon's negation effect to target it, making it trade with only 1 interruption instead of your entire board. Nowadays, even if Dragon Link isn't what it used to be anymore, this card can still be pretty scary when paired together with Bestials, which are essentially 2500 attack DD Crows, as you can use it to recur your Bestials every turn against graveyard-reliant strategies. And at number 4, we have Invocation. This card lets you fusion summon a monster using materials from your hand, but if you're fusing into an invoked fusion monster, you can also banish monsters from your field or either player's graveyards as well. If this card is in the graveyard, you can shuffle it back into your deck to return a banished Alistair the Invoker to your hand. Invocation is a pretty overtuned fusion spell. It's one of the few archetypal fusion spells which has seen play without being able to fuse from the deck. But it more than makes up for being a Miracle Fusion, a DD Crow, and also grabbing you follow-up all at once. Since Alistair the Invoker grabs you this card on a summon and then later gets banished when you're using it, Invocation's graveyard effect will pretty much always be alive while your engine is running. This means that if your opponent doesn't disrupt Alistair somehow, it'll represent a good normal summon and then a fusion monster for the rest of the game, while your extra deck still has invoked cards in it. This has led to Invoked being splashed in many decks which don't need their normal summon, with the most popular being Wind Witches when Alistair first came out, and then Mech Knights later on. The wide array of invoked monsters available not only lets you use your opponent's hand traps in the graveyard as free fusion materials, but they're more important monsters with graveyard effects. This versatility and compact package which Alistair, Invocation, and Magical Meltdown created made Alistair into a feature of many decks throughout the years. The most recent one being the Invoked Dogmatica Shaddoll DBE, which was a tier 1 threat for quite a while in the TCG. With all that said though, Alistair has kinda fallen off recently, as the adventure engine just fits better in the kinds of decks which would consider Alistair in the first place, but this doesn't change the fact that Invocation is still one of the strongest fusion enablers in the game. And at number 3, we have Phantom Knight's Fogblade. This is a continuous trap card which can be activated by targeting an effect monster in the field, and negates its effects and prevents it from either attacking or being attacked. While in the graveyard, you can banish this card to target a Phantom Knight monsters in the graveyard, and special summon it, but it's banished when it leaves the field. Coming out in early 2016, Fogblade certainly started a trend of archetypal back row that was both interruption and follow-up on the same card. While this card is really just Fiendish Chain, a generic card which had been mostly phased out of the meta at the time, everything surrounding it made it more than worth playing at 3 copies for a really long time. Fogblade became an instant staple in Phantom Knight Burning Abyss decks, which had tons of ways to set them up to use either of its effects. You could also very easily get around this card's downside of banishing the monster it brings out by just overlaying it into a rank 3 such as Dante, which makes it get sent to the graveyard instead. PKBA terrorized quite a few formats as one of the best combo decks around in Master Rule 3, and while it would leave the game for a while, the PKs would soon come back into the meta with the release of their Link monster support. Rusty Bardiche was played in all kinds of Goki and Orcus piles, as a generic Link 3 can go into for an easy +2 at the end of your combo, letting you either interruption with Fogblade, or an extender with Shade Brigandine. But Bardiche was not only a great way to set up, but also turned Fogblade's graveyard effect into an interruption during your opponent's turn, since you can use it to reborn Breaksword into Rusty's arrow for a pop. This even led to Bardiche getting banned, and when it finally came back a year later, Pure PK was still a pretty good deck for several formats, and it even went on to be one of the best adventure using strategies for quite a while, especially in the OCG. And at number 2, we have Breakthrough Skill. This is a normal trap which can target and negate an effect monster your opponent controls until the end of the turn. Then, during your turn, but except during the turn it was sent to the graveyard, you can banish it from your graveyard to target and negate an opponent's monster again. Breakthrough Skill represents a huge change in the paradigm for normal trap cards when it first came out, and would set the standard for pieces of one-on-one negation for years to come. Not only can this card be used to stop whatever your opponent is trying to set up during their turn, it can also be used to stop whatever they ended on during yours. This kind of value simply had never been available in any single trap card back then, making Breakthrough Skill into a must-have staple for a lot of control strategies for several years to come. This card only became more and more relevant as Burning Abyss and Shadow rose into the meta, as this is an excellent mill off of Dante, as well as one of the best ways to deal with the Windows Floodgate effect during your turn. Just as when this card's relevance was beginning to wane around 2017, That Grass Looks Greener came out, which can mill upwards of 20 cards from your deck to the graveyard, making it a must play again. All sorts of grass strategies benefited greatly from the free interaction this card gave you, and remained in the meta all the way until the card was finally banned. Since then, this card has almost entirely been relegated to Paleozoic decks, which have to max out on normal traps due to how their engine works, and even have the option to dump it for its grave effect with Paleozoic Morella. But even if Breakthrough Skill doesn't have a home in a tier 1 deck anymore, its impact can still be felt on card design to this day. Both Lost Wind and Titanocider are very obvious attempts at retraining this card's strengths for other eras, and while Lost Wind did end up seeing a lot of play, it never came close to how much Breakthrough Skill had seen. And finally, at number 1, we have Paleozoic Canadia. This is a normal trap that lets you target and flip down a monster your opponent controls. Also, once per chain, when a trap card is activated while this card's in the graveyard, you can special summon it as a level 2 Water Aqua monster with 1200 attack and no defense, that's unaffected by monster effects and gets banished when it leaves the field. Canadia makes number 1 on this list as one of the better Paleozoic traps, which all share the same graveyard effect. The Paleozoic archetype came out and gave a great way for trap decks to be viable in Yu-Gi-Oh!, even in its faster metagames. Since all of the Paleos come back from the grave when you activate a trap card, you can still generate a lot of field presence even if you just set 5 back row during your turn. Despite their tiny stats, the Paleozoics are surprisingly sticky due to being unaffected by monster effects while on the field, which usually means your opponent will need their battle phase to get rid of them. Even then, they're usually comboed together with Rise to Full Height, another trap with a great graveyard effect that could easily make this list to protect them from those battles. Top it all off, the payoffs for starting your turn with a couple of live Paleos out in the field was immense. You could either go for Paleozoic Opabina, which searches another Paleozoic card and lets you activate Paleozoic traps from your hand, or Totally Awesome, which gives you negate and a steal and is still considered one of the best XCs in the game to this day, being even banned in the OCG. Between Canadia, Danomishkis, and Olenoids, Paleo decks could deal with just about any threat your opponent put out. And then Morella and Lincolnia could let you spam Paleos and generate advantage. These kinds of decks were popular for several years, peaking when That Grass Looks Greener was in the metagame, as he'd give you enough fodder in the graveyard for the rest of the game. However, Canadia is the only one out of all of them who can say it was great outside of regular Yu-Gi-Oh! 2. Since, even if it might have not seen much play in the TCG lately, it's still one of the strongest staples available in Duel Links to this day. There isn't a group of better designed back row with graveyard effects than the Paleozoic archetype, and that's why they just had to be the number 1 spot on this list. Alright, and that's the list. If you happen to know of any other cards you might have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one, please let us know down in the comments below.